You're listening to The Main Event with Zach Gelb and Chase Sr. on WHIP.
Nice. A little Bruce Springsteen to bring us back. Rosalita, one of my favorite songs. And I know our next guest is a massive Bruce Springsteen fan, and he also covers hockey. He'll be at Madison Square Garden tonight for the New York Rangers game, where I'll be as well as the Rangers look to try to advance to the second round of the Stanley Cup playoffs. But more importantly, he is also an author of the new book, Shoot to Thrill, The History of Hockey Shootout, and that is our dear friend, Mark Rosenman. Mark, Zach, and Chase here in Philly, thanks for a few minutes. How are you, my friend?
Oh, my pleasure, Zach. Doing good. How can I do bad when you intro me with Rosie? So it's one of my nicknames, so good stuff.
Right on right. Rosie gets introduced by Rosie, and guess what? Just like how Bruce used to say he's the biggest author you've ever seen, you're a massive author right now when he used to talk about Clarence Clemens. We're trying. So why did you decide to write this book? Because it's a really interesting topic, because not many people would think, hey, I'm going to write a book about the history of the shootout and the penalty shot.
It's very interesting how the book came about. Obviously, I've been doing radio for quite a number of years, and as such, I get hundreds of books over each year. And I never really thought about writing a book. My good friend Howie Carpin, official scorer of the Mets, Yankees, has written 5 other books, kept on saying, he said, you should write a book. And I said, Howie, I just like interviewing people. I don't really like writing that much. It's more interesting for me what people have to say than what I have to say. He says, but I'll help you write a book. You can interview. That's the beauty of a book. You can interview hundreds of people. So we started brainstorming what would be a good idea, and it dawned on me when we're sitting there, what is my strong suit? Baseball and hockey, my Rolodex is filled with thousands of names. So I said, let's do something on hockey. The 10th year anniversary of the shootout was approaching. I figured there are a lot of different opinions on the shootout. There are different chapters and different things we can go with. So that's how it started. It was just a conversation between Howie and I up at the press box on the bridge at Madison Square Garden.
And I think it's the second chapter where it just gives every single interview about, and there's guys from Gary Bettman, the commissioner of the league. You also have other guys like Rick Nash, who's in the book. You have some Philly guys here as well, like Bill Clement and Brian Boucher. And it just gives everyone's opinion on that shootout. As there's so many interviews and stories, and you love hockey, we all know that, is there one story or interview that stands out in particular and says, wow, that was just really awesome, that was the best story in this book?
There's a couple of them. It's interesting to note, you mentioned the Philly guy. Brian Boucher is both, he's on both ends of the spectrum. The best moment of his career was in the shootout, and the worst moment of his career was in the shootout. He talked about his first shootout ever was in the preseason right after the lockout. They basically, every single team had a shootout after every single game just so they could get the timing and how it would, the format and how it would play out. And Brian Boucher, who was trying to make the team at that time, he was still a journeyman, actually injured himself in an exhibition game shootout. You fast forward to when the last game of the season between the Flyers and Rangers met the playoffs, and you go through his range of emotion of him being on the other end of Hank, the King, and he felt he had no shot at all winning that shootout. And, he won it, and his team went all the way to the Stanley Cup Finals. So Brian Boucher was very interesting. Brad Clark had a great story about Showdown, the fact that it was filmed during the exhibition season. He had taken the day off to fly down to Ontario to do the shootout. They figured that he was going to be, not attend the game, so there were a couple of Bruins there. There were a couple other guys from other teams there. So they began drinking. They drank all the way on the plane. The plane arrived early. He got to Madison Square Garden early, and Emile Francis had him penciled into the lineup. And he said that was the last time he ever touched a drink within 72 hours of an NHL game ever again in his life. Carol Sittler had a great story also about Showdown, that Punch Imlach was trying to stop him from participating as he was the head of the players union at that point. It got to a point where legal action was threatened. They had to change the jerseys from a Maple Leaf jersey. That year they wore a special NBC Showdown logo. There's just a lot of different interesting aspects that came out. Jason Woolley, the first guy to ever score a shootout goal in Olympic history. Not many people would think that. A defenseman scored the first one. He took us through that. Corey Hirsch took us through his part of being on the staff against Peter Forsberg, so we got his perspective. So really a lot of interesting things that we didn't know about that we came across during the your research and writing of the book.
Mark Rosenman, author of Shoot to Thrill, is our guest on the Main Event WHIP Radio in Philadelphia. Mark, it's Chase, and I'll never forget Brian Boucher stopping the Rangers to get the Flyers into the playoffs and gain number 82 of the regular season and making a memorable run to the Stanley Cup before losing to the Chicago Blackhawks in the Stanley Cup Finals. But here in Philadelphia, this also comes down to a lack of personnel, but the Flyers in recent years have not had a lot of success in the shootout. Just this past season, the Flyers lost 18 games in the overtime session combined with the shootout, and a lot of people here don't like it. But are you a fan of it, and do you see the shootout lasting in the National Hockey League in the near-time future?
Well, two things, Chase. First of all, from a Ranger perspective, I don't give Boucher the credit. I give Jokinen more.
Yeah, right into him, right?
I agree with you, Mark. I know exactly what you're saying.
But hey, Boucher gets credited with the save, right?
Yes, that's true. Number two, I think that the shootout is here to stay, but I think the frequency is what the NHL is trying to eliminate, make the frequency a lot less than it currently is. And the way they're going about that is the AHL test marketed going to 4-on-4 down to 3-on-3, and it did reduce the number of shootouts. I think the NHL really wants the shootout to be somewhat special. They don't want the thrill of it to be diminished because there are so many. So I think the shootout is still here to stay. Am I a fan of it? No. I think from speaking to a lot of players, a lot of PMs, a lot of coaches, it does reduce a team game to an individual skills competition. And I think that is where I've changed over the years. In the initial couple of years, I liked it. Obviously, the American Elite goal is one of the most memorable shootout goals there is. You take a look at how many wins Hank Henrik Lundqvist has compiled each and every year. These 30 wins in each regular season that has not been curtailed by a strike or a lockout, unsurpassed by anyone. But those 30 wins are not the same as Eddie Jockman's 25 or 26 back in the day, because at the end of the day, if it was a 1-1 game, you walked away with a tie. You didn't get a win. Now you can get that win in a shootout. So I'm not a huge fan of it anymore, so my opinion has changed in writing the book.
And I agree with you. I think the shootout originally really glorified the individual skill set, but I really think the NHL should do away with it. Mark, what do you think about the potential of having just a 20-minute overtime, and then if no team score, then you move on to the shootout?
I think the issue is logistics and buildings, and when you start getting to overtime and having to pay people that work at the arenas overtime for that, that's where economically things change for the NHL. And also, don't forget, people go, the NHL starts typically at 7 o'clock. You can catch a train, even with the shootout and everything. You're out of the arena by 10, 15 the latest. You now start tacking on a 20-minute overtime into a shootout. It changes the whole dynamic of the sport as well as televised. Lots of revenue is generated by these stations that have their post-game shows. I would not be opposed to a 5 to 10 minute overtime and then a tie. There's nothing wrong with the tie. Mark Howe said it best when he's a scout for the Flyers, and last year or 2 years ago, they went through a spring where they played really great hockey for 5 games. But in that 5 games, they had won 2, and they lost 3 in the shootout. When he said that his team was got to 1 point but lost in the shootout, it was like a loser's mentality in the locker room. You change the whole dynamic of a season and the way a team perceives itself because of the shootout. So I'm in favor of just going for a 5 to 10 minute overtime. If it's tied at the end of that, everyone gets a point, and that's it.
I'm not a big fan of just tying it, and I understand your point to that, as we're joined by Mark Rosenman, Shoot to Thrill, the history of hockey shootout. And just seeing, though, the really remarkable part of this book is you have so many generations of hockey players, hockey executives, and even hockey fans in this book talking about the shootout and the penalty shot. It seems like the general theme so far from what I've read, and I'm only a few chapters in, is a lot of the older guys don't like it, and a lot of the newer guys do like that there is some decision. When you take a look at this entire thing, and compare those eras, what was the best proposal maybe that someone gave in a way to change the shootout?
You know what? When he first told me it, I thought it was the most bizarre thing in the world. And I still kind of think it is a little bizarre, but it kind of appeased everyone. And that proposal came from Brad Park. Brad Park said the fans love the shootout. So why not give the fans a shootout every single game? They're guaranteed to see the shootout. The rub was, he said, the shootout would take place before the start of the third period.
Wow.
So regardless of score, so let's say it was a 2-1 game and your team was trailing, okay? So now in the back of your mind, you know that, all right, if you tie it up 2-2, you can get to a shootout or overtime and maybe win. Now what happens is, let's say you do tie it up, but before the start of the third period, you lost the shootout. Now in that 5-minute overtime, you have to push to get a resolution in your favor, so you're going for it rather than sitting back and trying to get to the shootout.
It's interesting.
So it was a unique idea. It will never, ever, ever happen. But it was the most unique proposal I think I've heard. It also ranged from different points like they do in soccer, and I think that's just a mess. I think people don't even understand the way the NHL standings go now with the ROWs and regulation wins and overtime wins. I just can't see awarding 3 points for a win. And, I don't think that's a solution either. I think what they're doing now is just trying to minimize the frequency of the shootout, and I think they'll go from there.
Rosie, before we let you run, the Flyers and really all Philadelphia sports is in a dark period right now. The Phillies are an absolute joke. The Sixers stink, and they're trying to rebuild with Sam Hinkie. The Eagles, they're all waiting to see if Marcus Mariota is the guy. But the Flyers, they fired Chief and Craig Berube. Who would you hire, though, if you were Flyers GM Ron Hextall to be the next head coach of the Philadelphia Flyers?
That's an interesting question. There's still going to be more fallout. More guys are going to be available. I don't know if the waiting period for the disaster that happened in Vancouver has been long enough. But I think that John Tortorella would be a guy who would bring back a winning attitude and a culture of winning and people buying into what it takes to be a professional hockey player. I think Torts would be a great coach for that franchise right now. But I don't know if it's too soon for him. And I don't know how the NHL is going to look upon him. And the Philadelphia media is just as brutal as the New York media, so I don't know if that would be a good match. Another guy who I think is a great coach, but I think he's more for younger guys, also developing a winning attitude, and I don't think he gets enough credit here in New York. If you take a look at the core of this team, they all came through him, and that would be Tom Rest. So those are two guys I think that would be interesting, prospects for the Flyers. But obviously there'll be a lot more guys out there. I would not go the AHL route with the Flyers at this point. You need someone established. And there's another guy who would be a great fit there, and that would be Mike Keith.
Mark, just real quick, what's the outsider's perspective on the state of the Philadelphia Flyers right now?
It's just a dysfunctional organization. You take a look at where they were a few years ago with that cup run, and granted, I don't think they had the talent. They got more out of that talent, but from the goaltending on out, the last couple of years has just been bizarre. The goaltending going back to the days of Hextall on truth, it's been somewhat bizarre. There's just so many awkward signings. Guys that, the LeCavier one is just the one that boggles the mind.
Brutal. Absolutely brutal. Yeah.
Yeah. I could understand it. Sometimes they're looking for a guy like a Marty St. Louis that brings a winning culture and can demand certain things, but you still have to have the talent left to back it up. And as great as Vinny was, he's got nothing left in the tank. Yager was that guy. Yager was a guy who, came to the rink every day, worked hard.
Yeah,
he was
let
a
him
guy
off.
that young guys wanted to do, but emulate. But I just think it's poor management, and just bringing in the wrong people at the wrong time.
Rosie, I'll see you tonight at the Garden in the press room. Thanks for a few minutes, and congratulations on the new book. Once again, it's called Shoot to Thrill, The History of Hockey's Shootout, and you get it on Amazon and a lot of bookstores, right?
Yes, absolutely. So thanks so much for your time, Zach and Chase. Appreciate it. See you tonight, Zach.
All right, sounds good. There's
Thanks,
Mark Rosenman. He is the author of Shoot to Thrill, The History of Hockey Shootout.
This
book is really good, too.
Of that proposal, though, a shootout before the third period, I think people in the stands would be going nuts. Everybody would be confused as to what's going on.
I wouldn't like it. I just wouldn't like it. It disrupts the flow of the game.
Yeah, and I'm always a fan of the unconventional thinking. That's a little bit too unconventional for me.
But this book, and I'm only a few
out.
chapters in, I'm sitting there, and I know Mark for a long time. He's from my hometown, actually, and we've done some radio shows together in the past. And I'm sitting there, and I'm just reading the book, and it is a hockey encyclopedia. The names in this book are just absolutely phenomenal. Commissioners,
anytime you get the commissioner,
executives, Stanley Cup champions. There's a fan section in the book from a fan of each and every hockey team.
That's really
and
cool.
I got to see Mark work behind the scenes during the Rangers Stanley Cup run last year where they lost to the Kings. And every night, he would be sitting there on the bridge at Madison Square Garden, you'd see Doc Emmerich, you'd see Pierre Maguire, you would see Sam Rosen, you would see all these guys just going to Mark and talking about the shootout, and you have so many different opinions, and there's a lot of Philadelphia Flyer people in there as well, like a Bill Clement, and then you have other guys in there, Brian Boucher, just so many guys about this book. It's really a worldwide kind of book about such a concept that is so controversial, and as Al Morganti said, it's one of the worst forms of things in sports in the Northeast.
My big takeaway, I just wanted to get the outsider's perspective on the Flyers.
Yeah.
Said it's a dysfunctional organization.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of people would agree with that.
I trust Ron Hextall. I do,
but I don't trust
I want to
Ed
see, though,
Snyder.
who they give the next coach. I don't trust Ed Snyder. I would make a push. The guy I would hire is Peter DeBoer. I like Peter DeBoer a lot. Mm-hmm. That's the guy I would have as the next Flyers head coach.
Babcock would be a great coach, and I think he's a good motivator. It's
going to be tough to get him, though.
But he's going to cost a lot of money. Mm-hmm. And then Todd McClellan is also that other guy out there. And then Morganti threw the minor league coach out there.
Yeah.
His name is escaping me right now, but just give me a fresh perspective. I'm done with the Flyer way and the Flyer culture. That's back in the 70s. Flyers haven't won a cup since the 70s. For 40 years.
I'm excited to go to Madison Square Garden tonight, by the way.
I mean, this is one of the best hockey fan bases in the world. I was watching a replay last night of the Flyers winning the Stanley Cup. Nothing better than
Back
that,
in
man.
the 70s?
The aura.
Broad Street Bullies.
The Broad Street Bullies. Man, get me back to those days. I'm starving for a championship, man.
Well, you're going to be hungry. You're going to be going to a few soup kitchens then, because right now, dysfunctional is the way you describe Philadelphia sports right now. It's brutal.
I know.
This is a time.
That's why we're predicting Eagles wins and losses.
Where you don't have a basketball team that you could watch yet. You don't have a baseball team. You can't watch them. I don't know how you went to the game the other night. I think you're a fool for that.
I might go tonight, too.
And then you have the Eagles. Oh, my God, you're going again?
I might.
You have a Stanley Cup playoff hockey. I would rather watch horses out in the field eating grass than to ever watch the Phillies this year in the regular season. That is an organization that is committed to losing, and they have no plan because they have a dope in Ruben Amaro Jr. running the whole thing.
I don't even know.
But you're still sucked in for some reason.
Because I love baseball.
You're doing it for the Instagram.
I love being at the old ball yard. I didn't even Instagram the pic the other day because there was nobody in the damn stands. It ruined it.
You and 45,000 strong, right? All right. Time in the studio right now is 11:34.
17,000 at the game yesterday.
Yeah.
More people go to Temple football
Let's be realistic. 17,000 BS. More like 5,000. All right. Time in the studio right now is 11:34. We'll take a quick break. When we get back, on the other side, he coached Tim Tebow in New York. That's Mike Westhoff. He's going to join us next. Tebow Mania right here. Philly's #1 college radio station, WHIP.